Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present my paper at this conference. I think, just for the sake of simplicity, I will read my paper rather than share the slides and do that transition at the same time. So my paper focuses on ethical leadership and systems thinking as some measures that could help to curtail the phenomenon of workplace mobbing. It is almost like you're trying to put an octopus to sleep, but there would be some tentacles showing up in some way or the other. So it is difficult, but we can always try. So let me begin. Tracing the sociological origins of the modern university leads one back to centuries past. Records dating back to the 12th century describe universities in Europe as religious communities of scholarship, where learned clergy dedicated themselves to understanding the deeper truths of the faith. Universities then were intellectual centers synonymous with the liberal arts and the sacred sciences. European universities gradually evolved from monastic and cathedral schools into institutions of higher learning that educated the growing elite and upper middle class. By the 19th century, they began to follow the Humboldtian ideology of holistic teaching and research, focused on nurturing in students not only the crafts of skilled tradesmen, but also an identity as world citizens with technical, professional, and cultural skills that shape their character and personality. Today, universities are recognized the world over as institutions essential for higher learning, accessible to the masses, not just to the elite classes, as in times gone by. Universities have now come to exist almost as corporate institutions with their own jurisdictional autonomy, academic freedom, and governance. The role and importance of universities as institutions of higher education in a country's social, economic, political, and cultural growth cannot be overstated. According to UNESCO, higher education institutions open avenues for social and global well-being of people and nations through opportunities for lifelong learning, sustainability, and digital innovation. Given the Herculean responsibility that higher education institutions have in shaping national and global futures, it is incumbent upon universities to attract the best talent and expertise as faculty and administrators. The Delors Commission report of 1996 identified learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together and with others, and learning to be as the 4 pillars of lifelong education. Yet these ideals might seem utopian given the dark workplace mobbing culture that has become a choking, invasive net in many institutions of higher education today. The malaise of workplace mobbing leaves deep scars on victims and their families. It damages the long-term credibility of the educational institution and, in general, dilutes the founding principles, educational goals, organizational integrity, and the quest for excellence and ethics that should be the actual true north for which these higher educational institutions operate. It is difficult to find a solution to this problem, but some positive efforts can be made in the right direction by conscientious individuals to safeguard the professional and personal dignity of victims of workplace mobbing, while also striving to preserve the integrity and greater good of universities and colleges of higher education with regard to their founding values and existential purpose. Drawing lessons from real-world case studies, this paper examines 2 complementary approaches to reducing workplace mobbing: ethical leadership and systems thinking. Understanding workplace mobbing, we all know that workplace mobbing as a social construct was first differentiated from workplace bullying by Lehman in 1919 and 1996. While bullying may be analogous to a playground fight between 2 individuals, workplace mobbing is a more sinister, endemic, and carefully crafted strategy. A collective campaign of elimination against a targeted individual perceived as a threat to the powers that be. Many sociologists and academics have contributed to the research on workplace mobbing, particularly as it manifests in academic institutions. Crawford, Denneth, Fogg, Lampman, Westhuse are prominent researchers who have extensively investigated workplace mobbing in academia. This malfeasance is not a one-off event. It is an intricate, pervasive, premeditated, systematic, covert process with deeply traumatic consequences for victims. Workplace mobbing is a social contagion that often results from a toxic workplace culture. In healthy workplace cultures, the disciplines of team learning, shared vision, positive feedback loops, and interdependencies accentuate organizational and individual learning. Toxic workplace culture breeds mistrust, compliance over independent thinking, competition, fear, and mediocrity. There is an erosion of employee morale, creativity, and productivity. Coping mechanisms for targets of workplace mobbing focus more on survival and acceptance by the majority than on ethics and excellence. Educational systems are complex adaptive systems. Therefore, when seeking interventions that could be preventative safeguards against workplace mobbing, adopting a systems thinking lens is helpful. Systems thinking supports continuous improvement, a paradigm that respects and values organizational interdependencies, shifting learning from reactive to proactive, and avoiding the assignment of blame to a particular stakeholder within the organization. Now, systems thinking, we look at systems thinking from the perspective of complex adaptive organizations, which our educational institutions are. According to Sullivan, a CAS within an organization is centered on a tripod of heterogeneous agents, evolving behavior, and emergence. The heterogeneous agents within the organization are the various stakeholders who can shape their behavior through interactions with other stakeholders within the system. This behavior leads to the emergence of a new organizational ethos or culture that is more than the sum of its individual parts. In an effort to understand this emergent organizational ethos, complexity cannot be traded for simplistic cause and effect solutions. There is often no linear solution to the problem of phenomenon. The focus has to shift to a network-based understanding of organizational agents and governance. Systems comprise many feedback loops that form underlying structures that reinforce, sustain, and control them, according to Senge. In most cases, the leverage for change might not even be clear to the stakeholders within the system. Educational institutions possess the following characteristics which are distinctive of CAS. They are the capacity to adapt for resilience. The whole is always greater than the sum of the individual parts. They have the ability to self-organize. There is the phenomenon of non-linearity where small changes could have large effects. There are feedback loops which reinforce or deter certain patterns of behavior. There is homeostasis that contributes to stability of structures, processes, and patterns of behavior within the institution. Communication between stakeholders for coordination and adaptation, specialization of roles within the system, spatial and temporal organization, and reproduction for continuation or maintenance of the status quo. Now, in Westyu's extensive and lifelong research on workplace mobbing, he surmises that universities and colleges are particularly vulnerable to a culture of workplace mobbing due to postmodernism and individualism. If an individual chooses to stand up for their principles and refuses to run with the herd, they set in motion the processes that lead to being mobbed. The story of Snow White, written by the Brothers Grimm 3 centuries ago, may find resonance in academic institutions even today. With possible structures that have homeostatically stabilized over the years, territorial boundaries of security and intimidation might be covertly marked. In such environments, new ideas may not be welcomed because there is the proverbial mirror on the wall, and the key players might be quite happy living in an echo chamber with a mirror that always says they are the most beautiful of all. This is how stagnation and mediocrity oftentimes seeps into the culture of universities and educational institutions. Though the university does provide opportunities for professors to explore avenues for individual creative expression, critical thinking, and the pursuit of excellence in research through publications, projects, extension activities, etc., the perceived reality is that reaching out to access these forbidden fruits can put an employee in harm's way. The space for jealousy, competition, and envy can often make a weakly ordered educational institution turn inward. There are systemic microaggressions in place focused on removing the employee who might rock the boat and force those who have reached a comfort level of drifting on the surface to work harder. So the more convenient and easier way is to stir up unrest against the victim, often even gaslighting students into joining the movement, so that the victim is forced to turn inward and focus on self-preservation rather than on mastery, professional growth, and distinction. This process of elimination becomes even more challenging when the victim is a tenured professor. The systems of microaggression are programmed to isolate and humiliate the victim, and the perpetrators do not have any remorse or conscientiousness about their actions. It is a system working against an individual. The individual is powerless to defend themselves, and there is no one they can trust. For the victim, avenues of redress from the educational institution's leadership might be virtually non-existent since the organizational environment seems unsafe. Faculty prefer to stay silent and perhaps look for employment opportunities outside the present organization. This has been proven by research. So, ethical leadership to safeguard institutional integrity. In Washington Irving's 1820 short story titled The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, there is reference to a headless horseman who rides through the town at night, spreading fear in the village. Organizations where workplace mobbing is prevalent often exhibit weak leadership, coercion, and fear-driven governance. Yet good leadership is the necessary fulcrum for leveraging organizational success. Getting people to work together and contribute their best is challenging. Cashman defined leadership as courageous and authentic, and as something that creates enduring value. Authentic ethical leadership could facilitate the creation of structures and systems that might serve as an antidote to workplace mobbing. Ethical leadership fosters a workplace culture in which employees feel respected, valued, and psychologically safe. Ethical leaders are visionaries who can see the forest as well as the individual trees. They care for the organization's reputation, integrity, accountability, and well-being, while also caring for the psychological safety, professional growth, and fulfillment of individual employees. Palmer, in 1998, stated that leaders can project shadows or light on those around them. It is incumbent on the individual leader to have the courage to go deep within themselves, to reconcile their own fears and insecurities as they take on the responsibility of leading their organizations. Collins, in his book Good to Great, describes such light projecting leaders as level 5 leaders. These leaders channel their ego towards the greater good of the organization rather than their own narrow self-interest. They are modest, willful, humble, and fearless. Given that educational institutions are complex adaptive systems, this is no simplistic assertion that leadership could be the magic potion to solve the malaise of workplace mobbing. Ethical leaders are cultivated and nurtured within the organizational ecosystem. Therefore, it is important to reiterate that systems thinking is essential for nurturing such leadership qualities within individuals in educational microcosms. So how do ethical leadership and systems thinking work together? Now, in his book, The Fifth Discipline, Senge in 1990 described a learning organization as one that can support the individual and collective aspirations of its employees through reflective dialogue and generative learning. He identified 5 disciplines that were characteristic of learning organizations. They were personal mastery, mental models, team learning, shared vision, and systems thinking. It takes dedicated effort by the institutional community to incorporate these disciplines. While many universities and institutions of higher learning might claim to have in place faculty appraisal processes to ensure that teaching staff are progressing through scholarship, research, and involvement in community building activities, in reality, these processes in themselves are intimidating and fearful because of the lack of transparency and authenticity on the part of administrators who are supposed to be faculty members, mentors through this endeavor. There is an unspoken implicit understanding that favoritism, nepotism, and unhealthy competition are the unseen landmines one must tread with caution and fear.
5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 more minutes.
Makes it more difficult for faculty because there's always more to do, more pressure, for greater visibility, which can lead to vulnerability that has counterproductive effects on an employee's well-being. In such an environment, it could be difficult to have the assurance that employee appraisal processes are authentic and carried out in good faith, because once more, the focus is on the question asked to the proverbial mirror in the Snow White story, who's the fairest of us all? So Parker Palmer talks about communities of congruence. Howard Gardner talks about the citizens of Reggio Emilia and how they worked together to create the educational institutions that their community actually needed. He also describes a person with an ethical mind as a trustee, as one who is a trustee of their profession and the planet. So what could organizations do? There could be rituals that could be designed to create communities of congruence where the 5 disciplines of a learning organization are practiced with diligence and care. Specific community building and leadership development exercises can be structured to unravel hidden mental models, prejudices, and apprehensions. There could be vision board activities where employees work together to learn from one another and build on each other's expertise, becoming stronger in their craft, knowing that the other colleague is not an enemy to be vanquished, but a collaborator to be cherished. Another key dimension to the Brown and his companions thought of another key dimension to the construct of ethical leadership, leaders serving as role models for employees by engaging in altruistic, fair, transparent, just, and credible behavior. Ethical leaders can use their leverage to steer employees' attention to standards and processes that are crucial to fostering organizational well-being through social learning models that reward appropriate behavior and call for accountability in examples of behavior that are disruptive to the health and well-being of the organization. Actions do speak louder than words. Okay, in the interest of time, I won't go to the case studies. I will only speak about the possible learning implications from my presentation. The policy implications that are an outcome of this research could be possible safeguards that could be put in place in academic institutions to make them safer spaces for faculty who work there. Keeping in mind the ethical leadership and systems lens that was discussed earlier, it could be optimal to create culture development and leadership building workshops as ongoing programs within the organization to nurture the 5 disciplines of systems thinking within an ethical leadership framework. This also means that universities must rethink their idea of tenure. Tenure should not offer senior faculty the freedom to mob their subordinates. In their research on academic mobbing, Dennett and Miswa have identified positional bullying as one type of academic mobbing. A person of higher power mobs a person of lower power. Researchers also point out that ambiguous expectations, promotion requirements, and subjective evaluations contribute to academic mobbing. Adopting systems of governance which are transparent, just, and equitable could reduce the occurrence of workplace mobbing. Universities must also have different tiers of ethical leadership that call for accountability in governance practice. It must be a standard practice to ensure that employees and leaders understand the founding values of the university or the educational institution and direct their behavior to translate that philosophy into action. Education is never merely utilitarian. True education is always value-based. Thinkers from Aristotle to C.S. Lewis to Flannery O'Connor have always stated that education without ethics and values is a deeply flawed and dangerous pursuit. Perhaps this is exactly why the world fears the rapid advances in artificial intelligence, because knowledge without morality can be a dangerous monster that can rapidly accelerate out of control. Universities must also have the integrity of intent in faculty feedback and appraisal processes. Encouraging anonymous feedback from students at the end of a course serves no real purpose. Because the course is over, students have damaged the reputation of a faculty member, and there are no opportunities for continuous incremental improvement, or even for the relationship between the professor and the students to improve. Universities and educational institutions must look beyond cost saving to value the contribution of the human person and the employees who most often come to institutions to give their best. As has been shown from repeated research investigations, workplace mobbing causes significant physical, psychological, and emotional damage to its victims. This cannot be allowed to continue. As academicians and people who care about knowledge, research, work, ethics, and higher truths, we must work together to end this malaise and reclaim for our universities and institutions of higher learning the glory of their original existential purpose. Thank you.